Sweet Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to thee, let it be, dear Lord.
Have your Bibles, please turn to the book of Ruth. And we'll get started in chapter 2 and verse 1 as the beginning to introduce the characters, I guess. Naomi, it says, had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Now, the lead up to this, and for those that are reading along in the reading plan this year, we read last week the book of Ruth, and so we're talking about the foundation that's laid in chapter 1 here. There had been a famine in Judah. And so Elimelech, who was from Judah, lived in Bethlehem. Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons move away from Judah into the nation of Moab to find food. Well, Elimelech died and left Naomi with her 2 sons alone. The boys grow up and they marry Moabite women. And after 10 years, both of the boys also died. And Naomi decides to return to Judah because she had heard that God had blessed Judah with food. So she was going to go home. Now, she encourages her daughters-in-law to stay in their nation, to stay with their families. They had better prospects there of finding husbands. Their husbands were dead. They were young widows. And eventually, Orpah, one of the daughters-in-law, she convinces to stay. But Ruth absolutely refuses. She insists on going with Naomi. She says, look, I'm going to go wherever you go. Your people are my people. Your God's my God. I'm going to die with you. I'm going to be buried with you. That's just the end of the story. And so she agrees, and Ruth and Naomi return home to the city of Bethlehem. And the text says that Naomi returned empty. That's the word that's used. And what that's talking about is Naomi left Bethlehem with a husband. She returns with no husband. Naomi left Bethlehem with 2 sons. She returns with no sons. She has no family other than this daughter-in-law who's a foreigner, a Moabite girl. She's got no wealth. She's got no prospects of recovery. There's no hope for Ruth as far as Naomi's concerned because no one is going to marry her and take care of her. And so they are going to be alone. And she gets quite depressed. And she has a very bleak outlook on life and a bleak outlook on the circumstances that she is facing. And it's just here that we're introduced to our person of consideration in this lesson tonight, and that's the man Boaz. Boaz is an interesting character. There's a lot of lessons to be drawn from the book of Ruth. We talk about Ruth a lot. We talk about providence a lot. We talk about a lot of things from this book. I don't know that we spend a lot of time looking at Boaz, and that's what we want to do tonight, is look at the character of this man who is called in Ruth chapter 2 and verse 1, a worthy man. And so if we look at the way that he is portrayed in this book, then we can understand the character that makes us worthy. And that's what we want to do here. But before we can do that, we have to consider a portion of the law of Moses. And so drop your ribbon marker at Ruth 2. We're going to go back there in just a moment. We're going to spend just a couple of minutes in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, though. So the law required that the people of God be thoughtful. Be thoughtful about those who are less fortunate. Be thoughtful about those who were temporarily in the land. And anytime that you are a traveler, you don't have your home, you don't have your stuff, you don't have a job, you don't have the means to produce for yourself. And so because of that, he says you need to keep them in mind as well. And this is the way that God instructed his children to provide for such people. Look at Leviticus 19, verses 9 and 10 with me. He tells his people, when you reap the harvest of your land, You shall not reap your field right up to its edge. Neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. Now, Leviticus is kind of a stiff collar type book. It was directed toward the leaders and the priests and the regulations and rules about how to do a lot of things. Deuteronomy is a much more general and practical treatment of the law of Moses, and we want to look at Deuteronomy's treatment of this part of the law as well. In Deuteronomy 24, we'll start reading in verse 19 and go through verse 22. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back and get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over them again. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widows. And that's all about how they harvested olives. They would go out with sticks and they would beat the trees. The olives would fall. They would collect them. He said, you can pass through the field once and there's going to be fruit left on the trees. You don't go through a second time. That fruit left on the trees, that's for the sojourner, that's for the fatherless, that's for the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not strip it afterward. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. See, he gives a reason now. He wants them to remember that they had been in a situation before where they were in a foreign land, where they were not in control, where they were poor, where they were destitute, where they needed help, so that they would in turn understand the motivation for doing this, for leaving part of their harvest out there for the poor and for the sojourner. You were a slave in the land of Egypt. I'll also add, if you recall the story of the Exodus, it was by providence of God and act of God that they left with anything at all. God made sure that the Egyptians provided them clothes and gold and wealth so that they had what they needed when they left Egypt. And so God is making provision for the poor and the sojourner. And he wants them to remember that. He said, therefore, I command you to do this. This is why. This is why I want you to remember. I command you to do these things so that you remember people, so that you see people. Those people who are marginalized, those people who are foreigners, those people who are weak, those people who don't have anybody else, who don't have a family to care for them. I want you to see them. And I want you to help them. And I want you to remember that you've been in that position yourselves. And not that generation, obviously. Well, actually, this generation specifically had. But they were all about to die in the wilderness before they received their promise. But anyway, that's what he gives them. That's the law that he gives them. There's three particular things about this I want to notice that are unique. Number one, what was to be left in the field unharvested? And he told them, don't harvest everything. When you go out into your grain fields, you don't harvest all the way to the edges. In other words, they could harvest from the middle, but they had to leave the borders of the field unharvested. That was the part that was easily accessible to people. The roads would pass by. That's where the food was. He didn't want the sojourner or the widow or one of those having to tramp through a field looking for a place where something was left for them. He wanted it to be easily seen, easily accessible, and easily reached by them. So he says, leave the edges unharvested so that people can reach it. Number two, the stuff that fell to the ground and would need to be gathered up after the harvest. That's what's referred to in the grain harvest as the gleanings. When we read in Leviticus, it talked about the grapes that fall to the ground to leave them. The food that just fell to the ground while going through the process of harvesting, he said, you leave that. That's for them too. And then thirdly, if you left something that you have harvested behind. So you've gone out, you've gone into your field, you've gathered the grain up, you've sheathed it all together, you've started packing it out in your carts as you move, and you've forgotten a sheaf of barley. He says, too bad. You leave that in the field. You don't go back and get it. That is for these people. Whether it was gathered and forgotten or still on the plant in the case of the olives and the grapes, where he said, don't strip the grapes bare and don't go back a second time to get all the olives. You don't go back a second time to collect what's left behind. That's the point. You get one pass, and what's left is left for other people. The easiest fruit to access and to gather was made available for the poor and the sojourner. The stuff that was already on the ground that could easily be picked up. The stuff that was at the edges that they could access. The easy stuff was left for these people. In that law, Naomi and Ruth are dependent upon. They are both widows. They are poor. They have no prospects. They have no hope except for this law. Verses 2 and 3 of Ruth 2. Ruth the Moabite says to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. Now, what I want you to understand is all she's saying here is mother-in-law, I'm younger than you. You stay here. I'll go out into the fields. I will ask permission to glean, and whoever gives me permission to glean, that's where I'll glean. That's what she's saying there. She said to her, go, my daughter. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. So she happens to come upon this field that belongs to Boaz. And it happens to be the case that that's also who Naomi's husband is kin to. But they don't know this, and nobody knows this. And Boaz is not looking at a Hebrew woman. Boaz is looking at a Moabitess. And we're going to see and notice something about his first impression of her in just a moment. But she comes to Boaz's field, and she asks permission to glean. And she's granted permission to glean the fields. Now, what we want to talk about with the balance of our time tonight is what Boaz did, because this is the important part in terms of application to ourselves and our lives and how we live. Look with me starting in verse 5. Boaz said to his young man, I want you to notice that language, to his young man. That's talking about a servant of his. That phrasing, that language is important. Boaz said to his young man, who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? What he saw in this young Moabite woman was the assumption of this was someone's servant. And he says, whose young woman is this? Who is she connected to? Who is she working for? The servant who was in charge of the reapers said, she's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. That's a commentary on the kind of work that Ruth was willing to put in. Boaz says to Ruth, this is verse 8, now listen, my daughter. Now you see that change. Upon finding out that she's connected to Naomi, he realizes that this is someone who's close to him. This is a term of endearment. Doesn't always apply to a family member, and in this case, there's no blood relations at all, not even close. But it's a term of endearment. And it shows the attitude that he has for this young woman. Listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one. keep close to my young women. His young women, that was his female servants. Keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And that's just a promise. What he's saying to her is, I've instructed my servants to leave you alone. And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. Okay, so we see at the very outset that Boaz is a man who honors the law of God. He knows that the gleanings are there for this purpose. He knows this is for a widow woman. He says, glean all you want to, and by the way, don't leave my field. Didn't matter that she's a foreigner to him. In fact, he understands that would be included in the idea of sojourners. He tells her, you don't have to go anywhere else. You don't have to travel anywhere else. You don't have to mess with anyone else. You just come to my field. As long as there's some food there, you have permission to glean it. You stick with my people, you follow them around, you just pick up behind them and take as much as you want. By the way, as you get later in the book, you find out she actually, that first day, got quite a bit of food from that first day's gleaning. He told her to stay near his young women and to watch them reap and then go right behind them and take the gleanings. He wanted her to have the first pickings, second pickings, but you get the point, of the gleaners. He also told her that if she got thirsty, she should just make herself at home, use his utensils, go to the place where his male servants were drawing water up, and drink as much as she needed. Then this happens. Look at verse 14. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread. Dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers as he passed her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves. Do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. So at lunchtime, he invites her to come to his table. You come to my table and you eat with me. Now this is reminiscent to me, at least, of Matthew 22 and the king's wedding feast and the picture of God inviting us to feast with him at his table. And I think it's supposed to be. Boaz is, in fact, a shadow of Christ. He is Ruth's redeemer. And so we're supposed to, I think, understand this connection. He allows her to eat until she's completely satisfied and even let her keep the leftovers. Then he does something, it's absolutely extraordinary. I think for at least most of us, this whole idea of not harvesting everything and leaving it for other people to take for free is extraordinary. We would go through and pick our fields dry and sell everything that we couldn't eat and make as much money as we could and not give any consideration. And if somebody was picking our stuff, it would irritate us and we'd run them off. That's not even extraordinary in this story. What happens next is what's extraordinary. He said, you know what? Even among the gathered sheaves, if she goes to the gathered sheaves and she starts taking that food, don't say a word to her. You let her have it. The law did not require that. But he did it anyway. He told his harvesters, look, what I want you to do when you're moving along, I want you to pull some of this. Intentionally pull some of it out of the harvest and throw it down for her. Leave some behind specifically for her. Law didn't require that. But he did it anyway. And what we see here is him going the extra mile. We see him being more generous than the law required him to be. We see him having more favor on people than the minimum requirement of God. And this is very similar to what Jesus would instruct later on in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 40. If anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. That's where we get our phrase going the extra mile from, by the way. That was based on a Roman law. The Roman army was at liberty to go through and press anyone into service for a mile. Say, look, you got to carry my stuff. You got to do this for me. Come with me, walk with me, take care of this work for me. And what Jesus told people was, if you're pressed into such service, don't stop at a mile. Go 2 miles. And that wasn't a hard and fast rule either. The point was, do more than what's required. Do more than the bare minimum. And that's exactly how Boaz lived. We can do it too. We don't have to merely do the bare minimum. We can extend ourselves beyond the minimum requirement. The people of Macedonia did. You'll recall in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 that Paul wrote, "We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that's been given among the churches of Macedonia, for in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part." They were being afflicted and they were poor, but they were overwhelmingly generous nonetheless. They gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord. That's what Boaz did. That's what the brethren of the churches of Macedonia did. And that is also the way that we can live. And there are lots of ways to do this. Offering of our time for the service to the elderly and the infirm, we can go out of our way. And not just do a little bit to say, well, I've done something. But to look for the opportunities and to make the opportunities and to give even beyond what is our duty. Offering a listening ear to the lonely or the suffering. Listen, just a phone call can change someone's life if they're sitting in a house by themselves hour after hour after hour after hour after hour. If you don't believe me, call somebody like that. See how long they keep you on the phone. Offering our time to teach children's Bible classes. Takes a lot of time. It's a lot of work. It's a pain. But we can do it. And we can go the extra mile. Offering our talents to serve the church in whatever ways are appropriate, whatever ways that are needed. We see an opportunity. All too often we walk past those. We don't even see it. We need to open our eyes. We need to look. And we need to have the mentality that Boaz has here. Seeing and then comforting the afflicted people of this world. There's a lot of people suffering in this world. We walk past them every day and we never see them, much less seek to provide comfort. Boaz saw this woman, and then he took the time to inquire about her. And then he took the time to say, okay, in what ways can I help these 2 poor widow women who can't do anything else? And he made sure to provide an abundance to them, well beyond what was required of him. Offering to share our insight into the gospel to the lost of this world. There's another way that we can give. Listen, I know it's terrifying. I still remember the first time that I walked into someone's house to talk to them about something like that. It's terrifying. I had somebody with me to help. He wasn't a whole lot of help. He sat there quietly, and we walked out, and he said, hey, you did good. But it's terrifying. You don't know what to talk about. You don't know how to broach the subject. You don't know what to say. You're terrified they're going to ask you a question because they may ask a question that I don't know the answer to, and then I look like an idiot. But you got to go the extra mile. You got to walk across the street and knock on the door. You have to talk. You have to ask the questions. You have to watch. You have to see. Like Jesus did with the Samaritan woman at the well, you have to see what it is that you can touch them with, where it is they're hurting, what it is they need, and then share the gospel which is able to save their soul. Boaz was not, I have done all that I'm required to do person. He didn't say, okay, checked it off. I've done what I'm required to do. That's not how he lived. We don't have to be that kind of people either. We can be gracious. We can be thoughtful. We can have our eyes open. We can be concerned. We can be compassionate. We can care about people. The rest of the story is fantastic, by the way. I trust most of you know it, but for the benefit of those that may not, it goes along and it develops, and he realizes that he could be the kinsman redeemer, except for there's someone else that actually is in line before him. That was another law that we didn't develop in this lesson, but that was a rule that if someone's spouse died and they were young and they didn't have any children, that the nearest kinsman would take them as a wife and bear children in the name of the one who had died. And there was someone else that was in that role, but Boaz goes to him and says, look, if you're not going to redeem her, let me know and I will. And they work that out, and then he goes and he marries Ruth. And you know how this book ends? With a short genealogy that gets us from Boaz and Ruth to David. And we find out that there is a Moabite woman who is an ancestor in the flesh of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. The word providence is never used in this book, but the providence of God is all over it. And it all starts with Boaz being a worthy man. If we make ourselves available to God, God can use us in great ways. Consider these things. Make application to your life as you see fit. If I'm wrong about something, if I've misread something and mispresented it, let me know. But I'm convinced that if we will live life the way that Boaz lived life, God will look at us and say, there's a worthy man. And don't, again, get caught up in the gender part of this. This is any of us. Doing what God requires of us, doing more than what God asks of us. Being generous, being caring, being gracious in this world to the glory of God. If we can help you in any way, let it be known as we stand and sing.